Good. Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
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 Good afternoon.
So, I am Edgar Rios. I'm a class of 1974. I'm a member of the board of directors of CBAP, and we welcome you this afternoon to our CBAP sponsored panel discussion on the issues of book banning, censorship bills, and defending the right to to learn. We have some exciting panelists that are going to discuss this matter, and they'll be introduced in a second. First, I would just like to give you some background on our organization, the genesis and the mission, if you will. A little over 4 years ago, after watching the viral footage of police officer Derek Michael Chauvin extinguishing George Floyd's breath while he called for his dead mother, and after witnessing the other officers present aid and abet the commission of this murder, while they kept a horrified crowd of onlookers um, at bay, uh, President, Princeton President Christopher Eisgruber issued a bold statement denouncing this act as symptomatic of systemic racism in America and called for Princeton to work to eradicate systemic racism at Princeton and beyond. Eradicate was his word. He then ordered the cabinet to submit proposals to that effect. As a result of his courageous statement, he received a strong scolding and threats from the Trump administration to withhold federal funding for Princeton. In addition to President Eisgruber's reaction, numerous Princeton undergraduate and graduate students, faculty members, and staff signed and issued a petition demanding that Princeton go beyond talk and become an anti-racist institution. Soon thereafter, a group of Black Princeton alumni gathered together and called on their fellow concerned Latinx, Asian, Native American, and white alumni, the only lifers in the Princeton family, both to support the statement of the president and to act in solidarity with the demands of the faculty, graduate, and undergraduate students as expressed in this petition. As concerned alumni, we not only circulated and are still circulating that petition to our fellow alums to sign, we also issued a proposal for the university to establish the Princeton Applied Research Center to come up with policies across all disciplines and areas of life to combat and eradicate racism as a dynamic and responsive engagement in the anti-racist struggle. Conceptually and practically, the center will work across disciplines to research and develop policies to combat and eradicate racism. Today, we are joined with um, with exceptional, distinguished alumni to discuss these issues on banning, censorship. Um, I want to, I would like to extend a special welcome to all of you, all of our guests who have, joined us for the first time on one of our panel discussions, and encourage you to listen and participate in these discussions with a mind towards hopefully joining a committee or getting involved actively and being bringing either your time, your talent, or expertise to the table to assist CBAP in reaching our goal to establish the center. At the end of the presentation, we will reach out to anyone who has questions or would like more information about working in some capacity with CBAP. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to our moderator, uh, Ariel Rogers, class of 2008, also a board member of CBAP, and an active member of our planning committee. Ariel?
Thank you, Mr. Edgar. Appreciate that introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. We'll call and response.
Good afternoon.
There we
Good
go.
afternoon.
There we go. Because I
Good
know a lot of us
afternoon.
must come from church.
Good
There we
afternoon,
go.
Professor
Okay.
Rogers.
And so we're gathered here today at a critical moment in history, one where the freedom to read, learn, and engage with diverse ideas is under attack. Across the country, we are witnessing an alarming rise in book bans and censorship, particularly targeting works that confront racism, celebrate marginalized voices, and challenge the status quo. But let's be clear, book banning is not just about restricting access to literature. It is about controlling narratives, erasing histories, and silencing truths that make some uncomfortable. Censorship is a powerful tool of oppression, and it has long been used to sustain systemic racism. That is why we must go beyond resisting book bans. We must create spaces that actively combat the forces that seek to suppress truth and justice. A dedicated center for the eradication of racism at Princeton University is not just necessary, but it is urgent. Such a center would serve as a hub for education, advocacy, and empowerment, ensuring that the voices being silenced today become the voices that shape our future. Tonight, or this afternoon, we will discuss the impact of book bans and the role of censorship in perpetuating racial injustice. And I challenge us all to think boldly. How can we not only defend intellectual freedom, but also build the institutions needed to dismantle racism at its roots? The fight against censorship is a fight for truth, equity, and liberation, and it is a fight we must win. And to continue to unpack this topic, we have with us two fantastic, prolific Princeton alumni, Professor Emerson Sykes and Dr. Destiny Crockett. Good afternoon.
Hi there. Thank you so much.
So let me give the folks, the people, a little background about you both, if you don't mind me tooting your own horn just a little bit. So Professor Emerson Sykes is a staff attorney with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where he focuses on the First Amendment free speech protections. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2018, he was a legal advisor for Africa at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Professor Sykes previously served Assistant General Counsel to the New York City Council, and he holds a JD from the New York University School of Law, where he was a Root Tilden Kearns Scholar for Public Interest Law and a Master of Public Assistance degree from the Princeton University of Public and International Affairs. Before graduate school, Professor Sykes worked for the National Democratic Institute's Central and West Africa team. He earned his undergraduate degree in political science at Stanford. Additionally with us, we have Dr. Destiny Crockett. She is a scholar artist who is curious about African-American girlhood in the 20th and 21st centuries, Black feminism, 20th and 21st century African-American women's literature, and visual culture, Black archive theories, and Black queer studies. Some of her published works include Denitra Vance's Cabrini Green Jackson and the Performance of Black Girlishness, Visual Arts Research and Black Girlhood in Toni Cade Bambara's Literary Archive, and Black Feminist Archival Approaches, Resources from American Literary Study. Dr. Crockett earned her PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania with certificates in Africana Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Her BA is in English with a certificate in African American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies from Princeton University. Dr. Crockett, Professor Sykes, again, thank you so much for your time and joining us today. Just to kick this off, a little icebreaker. I'm curious, what are you currently watching, listening to, and reading? Professor Sykes, if you don't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks for having me. Nice to be with you all. It feels like a webinar. I promise I'll try to be as substantive and as informative as possible, but it also feels like a family meeting, and I appreciate that on this Sunday afternoon. So I'll say, for what I'm watching, reading, and listening to, watching, the worse the news is and the busier my job is, the more trashy the TV I watch is. So I'm not going to admit to you what it is I might be watching right now, but there's a new show about a Palestinian comedian named Mo Amer, and Ramadan just started, so I'm going to try that one. I'm reading, as you'll hear about, mostly about executive actions and the litigation responding to those executive actions. I wish I had time for other reading. And what I'm listening to, I'll throw out there, I was on a panel recently with Killer Mike, who had the album of the year last year. And so I've been listening a lot to Killer Mike. He's a complicated character. He's a big racial justice guy. He's a big free speech guy. He's also a big guns guy, Second Amendment guy. So in the strain of sort of listening to complicated and dissenting voices, I'm listening to lots of Killer Mike these days. But I'm interested in hearing from Dr. Crockett.
Thank you for those questions and for that introduction. So I'll start with what I'm reading. Well, last week I was able to vacation in Cartagena, where and every time I travel, I go and buy some Black books that I've already read in the language of the place that I'm in. So I am rereading Asada Shakur's autobiography, but in Spanish this time, just to brush up on my Spanish. So my goal is to finish it and get through it. That's what I'm reading. In terms of listening to, I've been listening to a lot of Donny Hathaway and Dinah Washington lately. I guess that reflects a more melancholic mood than what I'm actually feeling. And then what I'm watching is, I like those PBS documentaries, like the mini ones that have been on YouTube. I can't believe they're free. But one of my favorite ones was on the history of blue jeans in the US.
I'll follow that one up myself. Reading, I'll get into that. Reading, I'm reading Marie Laveau, The New Orleans Voodoo Priestess. Watching, I recently went to the Oscar Shorts documentary screening and saw the film Incident, heart-wrenching, where it showcases the assassination murder of a Black young man in Chicago in 2018 at the hands of police. And you see in 4 different simultaneous screens this young man's life slip away while the police are crafting their story. I would highly recommend it. It's super powerful, and it is fully in alignment with what started this whole committee. And then listening to, I'm still on GNX, Kendrick Lamar. So I'm still on that kick. So to kick us off, first question I wanted to ask, how does the topic of book banning show up in your world, and how are you responding to it? If you would like to start with Dr. Crockett.
Thanks for that question. So right now I'm a postdoc at Rutgers, and it's actually my final semester as a postdoc. This semester, I actually have off from teaching, so I'm just in my research. So right now, in terms of my day job, book banning isn't completely impacting any work that I do in the classroom. So my last class was in the fall, and I was able to teach whatever I wanted to teach. But as y'all probably know, Rutgers receives a lot of federal funding. So I'm not sure what that will look like for people who find themselves situated at Rutgers. I'm at the Rutgers Camden campus, though I live in Philly, who find themselves trying to teach Black studies or gender studies at Rutgers in the future. I can speak more to how book banning could impact my life outside of my academic work, because I do a lot of things. So I'm starting a nonprofit organization. Right now it's an LLC called Maroon Strategy. And what we'll do in this time is match working class Black parents in Philadelphia whose children are struggling with literacy with, the funds to see private reading specialists to get the assessments that they need. as well as transportation to get to and from sessions with those reading specialists beyond school. And for our purposes, there's a grant that we're starting called the Library Cut. So Black English, like give me a cut of something. So it's the library cut, and that's for parents to basically apply and receive an unrestricted, well, it's kind of restricted grant of a few $100s for them to populate their children's at-home library. And I'm partnering with a Black woman's bookstore called Harriet's Bookshop in Philadelphia. And so the reason that is important is because when or if books are removed from public libraries, so the Free Library of Philadelphia, children who rely upon libraries or other means of getting access to literature for free are not going to have access to certain texts, though private entities such as bookstores, and in particular Black-owned bookstores, can still sell mostly what they want to sell. And so what I noticed, because I was a first-generation college student, was a child of the St. Louis Public Library, was always at the library. What I am assuming is that the children who do not have money to buy books and to populate an at-home library are going to be the most impacted by book bans.
Professor Sykes?
That's a really important point. Bookstores are not the same as libraries. So the way that this is showing up in my work is full-time. This is what I'm doing basically full-time in my work at the ACLU. Today, the book banning issue that is front and center, as many of you may have seen, as a result of this slew of executive orders that this administration has put out, among the many impacts has been on Department of Defense schools. So I don't know if you have seen this, but on bases, the Department of Defense runs schools. And because, I mean, we can get into sort of the legal technicalities if you want to, but basically, because the Trump administration very much wants to send a chilling message around curriculum, around books, throughout the federal government, but also throughout the public school system. The problem is that Trump doesn't have that much control over schools. Well, his problem is that he doesn't have that much control over public schools generally, but he has a lot more control over the Department of Defense and their schools. So I think it's, in some ways it can seem like, why are we focusing on this when all these other things are going on? But it's the canary in the coal mine. And we think it's something very important to push back on because this is an idea that they're trying to permeate everywhere. But the first line of folks who are being impacted, I think, most directly is at these Department of Defense. It's called DODEA, Department of Defense Education Action, weirdly, but it's DODEA or activity, I think. And so right there, books have already been removed. Black History Month, as you probably saw, was canceled. The things have been removed. Immigration unit has been removed from the curriculum. All sorts of, even mention of a Civil War soldier who was a woman who dressed as a man in order to serve. Something we probably all learned about those types of anecdotes in our childhood. As flawed as our education was, that was the kind of funny anecdote we could learn, or interesting anecdote. And even those types of examples are being pulled. So we are trying to prepare litigation. We're talking to parents, we're talking to students, we're talking to teachers, we're talking to other activists, and trying to figure out what, if anything, we can do in the courts to push back on this and lots of other types of issues that we're facing, of course, in immigration, trans rights, racial justice. The list is so long, but just in terms of book bans and curricular restrictions, which is solidly within my portfolio, we are actively trying to prepare a case to push back against some of these things. But as you said, Professor Rogers, this is not a new issue. This is a new fire drill in response to these executive orders, but these are not new issues. And I have been, over the last 4 or 5 years, litigating bans on critical race theory and bans on inclusive education around the country. This wave, that previous wave started after the summer of 2020, when we had the massive racial reckoning, the massive protests in the streets. CBAP, I believe, came sort of out of those moments, as you were talking about earlier. And in the first Trump administration, we saw something called Executive Order 13950, which you may be familiar with, which set forth a set of 8 divisive concepts that are not allowed to be, that were banned in government trainings and for government grantees and contractors. And this is in the first Trump administration. That executive order was blocked by a federal court, and it was withdrawn by President Biden on his first day in office. But that list of 8 divisive concepts has gone on to live 1,000 lives in resolutions, statewide bills, and now has come back again in these new sets of executive orders. Thankfully, some small bit of thanks. In the meantime, we've been litigating this list of divisive concepts as it has been applied to K-12 and higher ed classrooms, and mostly successfully. We blocked the law in New Hampshire completely. That was a law that covered K through 12 education. In Florida, it was called the Stop Woke Act, and we blocked that one as it applies to higher education. That's currently on appeal. The one in New Hampshire is also on appeal. In Oklahoma, that was the first federal lawsuit challenging one of these bans on inclusive education. We filed it in the fall of 2021, and that case is complicated. It's now on discovery, on equal protection. It's in the 10th Circuit on appeal, and we're also in the Oklahoma Supreme Court on some certified questions of state law. So that's a long-winded answer to say that we are trying to fight these things in the courts and also through public advocacy. I'm an attorney. I focus on the litigation side, but we also have communication strategists, legislative folks, all sorts of different folks within the ACLU framework and partner organizations from all over the country who are doing our best to push back against these things. But for me, that takes the shape of 3 active cases and one hopefully to come, or more.
Beautiful. To that point, I was wondering, Professor Sykes, can you expound on or explain what is curriculum transparency laws? How do they relate to the other censorship bills?
These were a sort of a second generation of the curricular bills that sort of came out of the executive order. As you said, book banning is an old issue, right? Like the effort to remove uncomfortable ideas from public discourse is something that people in power have always tried to do, right? So our eternal vigilance is necessary. But there are these waves and these issues that kick up. And so one was around curriculum restrictions, as we said, around these sort of 8 divisive concepts. But these are, how we teach about, learn about, discuss our history was at the heart of those protests in 2020. And it's at the heart of, I think, the idea of this applied research center, right, is to try to sort of get at these core issues within our society. Knowing that banning ideas is very difficult to do under the First Amendment and controversial in American society, at some point there was a pivot. I hate to mention his name on this type of gathering, but Chris Rufo gets a lot of credit, unfortunately, for that list of divisive concepts. He planted this idea in Trump's head. The executive order happened. Rufo also was the one who was behind the weaponization of the phrase critical race theory. And he, I used to talk about, he's created a bucket and he's pouring everybody's racial anxieties into this bucket that he's labeled critical race theory. And I thought I was really clever for coming up with that image. Someone sent me a tweet of his from like 1.5 years ago where he said, "My goal is to make all anxieties have a home in the idea of critical race theory." This was his plan. He explained it. He said it out loud. This was obvious. As we started to rack up some victories in the courts against these divisive concepts and CRT, there was a pivot to curricular transparency. And this was an attempt to say, we're not telling you what ideas you can and cannot teach. We're just saying we want parents to be fully informed about what's being taught. Now, we at the ACLU, and I think folks who are concerned, parents like myself, parental input and information around education is critical. It's important for the child, it's important for the parent, it's important for us as a society. So no one's against transparency generally, but what this was an attempt to do was to try to create very onerous mechanisms through which you could have a veto of one among parents, right? So forcing teachers to open up their curriculum, not just to share what's being covered, what are the topics that may be discussed and those sorts of things, but to make it difficult for the teachers to do their jobs and to make it so that any parent could request this information, could lodge a complaint, and in the most extreme examples, one complaint could trigger discipline. And so this was an attempt not just to, the sort of label of transparency was an effort to sort of make us look bad by being against transparency. And to be fully transparent, the ACLU tweeted something about these transparency bills, and we worded it poorly, and it became viral if ha ha ha, the ACLU is against transparency. And that's exactly what they were hoping to do. But these laws really didn't have much to do with transparency. They were just trying to create another mechanism whereby activated parents from the right who are uncomfortable with their children learning about oppression of any kind that may have been perpetrated by people that look like them, to try to silence those voices, ban those ideas, and importantly also, make those teachers fear for their careers.
Dr. Crockett, just to shift and give it a more philosophical approach, can censorship, in your opinion, ever be justified? And if so, in what cases?
Thanks, I appreciate this question. I think first I'm gonna sort of, this is related to this question, but also the first one. So in terms, I'm currently on the academic job market, which is, I'm having a wonderful time applying to many, many jobs. And what that means is that I was just at an interview in which I was asked a question about DEI and how I thought that might impact my work and what I'm able to teach. And so it sounds probably more sarcastic or snarky than I intend, but I explained it by saying I don't actually teach DEI, and I didn't study DEI as a doctoral student at Penn or as an undergraduate at Princeton. I teach Black studies, I teach gender studies. And so the reason that I say that in terms of book bans and censorship is because when I'm teaching the work of Gwendolyn Brooks, or Sonia Sanchez or June Jordan, I'm not really teaching DEI, and I may or may not be teaching divisive subjects. I mean, I'm sure I am, but I think more importantly, I'm teaching Black cultural traditions and practices. The reason that that is significant to me is because it clarifies that it's not only, so it's divisive topics, as you're saying, Dr. Sykes, but we know dog whistles exist, and so it's really just Blackness that's being banned. Blackness, conversations about queerness, conversations about gender are being banned. And to your other question about censorship, I'm not sure that I would say censorship is ever okay, but I think censorship is one of those terms that has a social life. So it can mean different things in different conversations and to different people. And so on one hand, censorship is deciding the children or the students, because again, I'm teaching college students right now, should not be able to learn this thing because it could be divisive or because it could make people uncomfortable. But I've been doing some reading about content warnings and trigger warnings and the history of them, not necessarily just in mainstream, but in the feminist classroom and in feminist studies, more broadly speaking. And so the conclusion that I'm coming to is that everything could make somebody uncomfortable. It doesn't necessarily have to be something about race, gender, queerness, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. And I think to that point, I don't only teach texts that I like or that I enjoy teaching. I don't only teach the works of people who belong in the canon. So for instance, I have a Black popular culture studies syllabus. We're gonna talk about R. Kelly. We're gonna talk about Bill Cosby. Are we going to talk about those artists because I prefer to? No, I don't listen to R. Kelly in my home and haven't, and will leave a party and have if people start playing R. Kelly. But in terms of the arc of Black popular culture, I have to include this person that we call the king of R&B, because I have to ask the class how we're able to call this person the king of R&B, knowing who he has been over decades. I have to include America's favorite dad, Bill Cosby, so that we can think about his role as America's favorite dad, and how the Cosby Show was able to reach a broad audience, but especially to appeal to Black bourgeois sensibilities. Those are questions that I have to ask, whether I agree with the people or not. So to answer your question, no, I don't think censorship could ever be appropriate. And I think we ought to get comfortable teaching things that we don't like, or that we're uncomfortable with. Our role as scholars and teachers is to contextualize those things.
Professor Sykes.
Can I stay on that one? I would be,
Please.
can I get a crack at that one? That was, Professor Crockett, that was fit. I mean, I couldn't agree more in terms of the idea that of scholars teaching things that they don't necessarily approve of. It just shows that the folks who are trying to ban ideas don't really understand the academic project to begin with, I think. And I think, when we think about censorship from a legal perspective, the question is always who's doing the censoring, right? So I didn't sort of give the introduction to the First Amendment type of stuff, but I think it's important just to say that we care about free speech in lots of ways and lots of kinds of censorship, right? But the First Amendment is only about the government censoring private voices, right? So the courts, the legal system, the Constitution will only step in when it's the government censoring private speakers. So if it's private speakers censoring each other, that's important. That's something that we should discuss, and that's something that we should study. But that is not censorship under the way that the First Amendment thinks about censorship. That's feedback, right? And so the difference between discussion or negative feedback among private folks versus the government telling you what's allowed and what's not allowed, we say is categorically different. Similarly, though, when the government is speaking on its own behalf, the First Amendment doesn't apply because supposedly there's no private speaker, right? So what we've seen more and more is if you're a government employee at work, that's the government speaking. Therefore, your DEI office is gone, right? You don't have anything to say about that. You don't have any First Amendment rights because that's the government regulating itself. The key question here and the gray area that we are dealing with is public schools, higher education, and K-12. They're government entities. The government creates the curriculum on some level, not in higher ed. Professor Crockett creates her own syllabus, but the sort of Psych 1, Princeton decides who's going to teach what are going to be the requirements. Obviously, Princeton's a private university, but even for public ones too. And in K-12 schools, the Department of Education creates the curriculum. So when the librarian removes a book from the library, who is censoring whom in that situation? That is distressing for everyone in our society when books are removed for all the reasons we all agree about. But the legal difficulty comes when the question is who is doing the censorship and who is the private voice that's being censored. Sometimes book writers, publishers, have sued on their own behalf for being removed. We often sue on behalf of students who have had their right to receive information impacted. And that's a First Amendment right that we argue is important, but many courts have not necessarily recognized fully. But when the government is acting within its own institutions, it has a lot more authority. And so what we've argued is, even though the government has lots of authority to create the curriculum, even though a public university is in many ways a government institution, when the censorship is not reasonably related to any pedagogical interest in K-12, they're not saying that they're doing this because it's the right thing to do, it's appropriate for kids. They're doing it because they don't like BLM, because they didn't like seeing the protests, because they don't want people to feel bad about racism. So we've said that these are not legitimate reasons to remove scholastic materials, even though you as the state in theory have the authority in some circumstances to remove those materials. So what is censorship is tricky because who is the censor and who's being censored? The other thing I would say though is in higher education, we're talking about viewpoints being censored. And we think that that is sort of a red line. You can, Professor Crockett, you know that you're being judged based on your ideas in these interviews, right? Like these deans, these professors, these search committees are looking at your ideas and they're judging you based on your views and your writing. And that's just a part of the academic process, right? That's not necessarily censorship per se, but that's very different from the legislature. So the academy regulates itself, and there is some viewpoint-based regulation that happens within the academy based on expertise and pedagogy. But what we've seen is the government, specifically state legislatures, and or in this case, the executive branch, dictating which ideas are allowed and not allowed. And I didn't mention what is actually in the divisive concepts. I know I'm talking a lot, but it's worth mentioning just when we say the divisive concepts, what's actually in them. There are 8. And they range from relatively innocuous. They're cut and pasted. They get tweaked a little bit, but the basic version is, the first one is, you're not allowed to teach that any one race or sex is inherently morally superior to another. No one was really teaching that. So banning it doesn't really seem like that big a deal, but it's weird, right? There are other divisive concepts, though, that are totally nonsensical. My quote unquote favorite is the 4th one. It says, you're not allowed to teach that anyone because of their race or sex cannot or should not attempt to treat others without regard to race or sex. You're not allowed to teach that anyone cannot or should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. Cheryl is laughing because she's heard me talk about this before. This is what the judge in Florida called the rare triple negative. So we're bringing First Amendment claims, but we're also bringing vagueness claims because these executive orders and most of these laws don't make any sense. But that's on purpose because they're confusing and people are erring on the side of removing everything. And there are some, though, that are specifically targeted. You're not allowed to teach that anyone can or should be treated differently because of historic wrongs committed by people of the same race or sex. That is a concept you are not allowed to teach according to these executive orders and some of these laws. And that is getting to the heart of teaching about affirmative action. That one's not so vague. That it's clear exactly what they're talking about, right? So when we look at these divisive concepts, that's what we're talking about. Some of them are weird, some of them are nonsensical, and some of them get to the heart of exactly what so many of these critical race theorists, the actual critical race theorists who do this in law schools, are actually trying to get at.
Please.
Yeah, I want to say that while scholars in higher ed do get to determine what our curriculum is going to be, for junior scholars like myself, yes, you get to determine what you're going to put on your syllabus. But since institutions are being censored, really right now, if these institutions want to keep their federal funding, and the institution that I just interviewed for does receive federal funds, then they really shouldn't be interviewing anyone who does Black studies or putting out a job market call for African American literature or Black feminisms. So yeah, I get to decide what's going on my syllabus. But right now, it seems that institutions like Princeton, who are being threatened, they're a private institution. They're a private and especially wealthy institution. But the institution that I just interviewed at, Rutgers, and several others, or almost a couple thousand others, really are going to have to crack down on hiring and kind of freeze hiring if they want to continue receiving federal funds. And so it won't really matter what I put on my syllabus. It'll only matter that my training is in Black studies, which would render me unhireable. And so for tenured faculty or full faculty, their jobs, I guess, maybe are relatively secure, but they might be censored even down to the titles of their classes. If that makes sense.
That was absolutely. I'm sorry, do you want to continue?
Just quickly on that, I think that's extremely important, and it highlights sort of the limitations of the legal strategies, basically, because as I was saying, like as you said, Dr. Crock, like the university gets to decide what departments exist within it. Like we are arguing that the government can't censor ideas, but it's much harder for us to argue that a university can't open or close a particular center, or can't, fund or unfund a particular department, right? Like we can advocate, we can lobby, we can do all sorts of things, but it's not really some like the legal, there's not really a legal answer there, because that sort of falls more within the core of the university's actual authority, which is to decide which majors, which centers, which all those sorts of things that it will offer. So, what good is it at the end of the day if the center is gone? And I think you're right. That's my only my only tidbit is that the legal answer kind of stops there, unfortunately.
And you both sort of answered the next question. If you have more to expound on, how do book bans and censorship affect historically marginalized communities and diverse voices? I think you really just gave a nice bird's eye view of how that trickles down, whether it's overtly or if it's just like, oh no, we just don't even offer that department anymore. Or if it's the titled professor, the course. But if you had any other comments that you wanted to expand upon that, even if it's outside of racial titles and concepts, how the censorship is going to historically or has historically marginalized communities of diverse voices. Dr. Crocker? You did a beautiful job of speaking on it before.
Yeah, so I think for me, both personally and professionally, what I have known since I guess junior year at Princeton is that an academic career is where I'm starting, but it won't be my final stop. And the demographic that I am primarily concerned with are Black kids Black kids in the US whose path to college is uncertain, like mine was, and like the family that I come from. So I grew up on the south side of St. Louis. I relied upon the public library for a couple of different things. One's internet and computer access to apply to college, to get homework done. But the other was a sort of after school programming and babysitting. And the third is in the high school I attended, so I was a kid of St. Louis public schools. So my high school was like right across from some notoriously under-resourced projects. And I'll just say that the majority of the books I was reading in high school were not books that were assigned at high school. I was supplementing my curriculum through the St. Louis Public Library. I was supplementing my curriculum through the school library. And I was lucky enough that even in a working class neighborhood and working class urban school system, those libraries were always well kept. And so what I'm thinking about is how will Black children in Philadelphia, where I am now, in St. Louis, be most impacted by decreased access to not just books, but to books that have to do with their people. Books that I encountered in the St. Louis Public Library, which included things like Lorraine Hansberry's Young, Gifted, and Black autobiography. I was reading Michael Eric Dyson and Cornel West all when I was about 11 or 12 years old in St. Louis. And so those texts helped me consider myself not just a person, but a person who is a part of a people, and to think of Black people as part of a collective people. And so how would I have been able to supplement my education without those institutions that offered free unbridled access to books? So that's something that I'm thinking about. How will Black children, especially considering this conclusion that education scholars have come to, which is that Black children do better in all subjects when racial pride is instilled within them. And part of that has to do with literary study and exposure to Black arts through cultural institutions. So how will Black children in places like Philadelphia and St. Louis have access to that? if their access to text is dramatically reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Though in Philadelphia, I'll say, and in Pennsylvania, most of the banned books are not necessarily like there's Beloved, but many of those books are like Captain Underpants, things that are like have quote unquote crude humor. It's just Captain Underpants. He just flies around wearing his drawers and he might make a few fart jokes. But those graphic novels, because I tutored all through grad school and undergrad, those graphic novels are books that grab readers who otherwise wouldn't read or wouldn't be interested in text.
That's it's such a powerful narrative. I mean, I'm not surprised that you ended up where you are, given that you were reading Cornell West when you were 11 or 12, but I'm not surprised. You are. It's an inspiration, but it's also, as you said, like, how are somebody going to follow it? I mean, not that those are easy footsteps to follow in to begin with, but that critical resource that libraries can be is a super powerful story. The only thing I would add is that I think in terms of the value or with the impact is, we all know what it's like to be erased from the curriculum, right? So we know what that absence feels like. I think we're all of a generation where we don't necessarily, most of us, I see a class of 24 in there, but most of us are of a generation where we experience the absence as much as we experienced any presence of seeing ourselves. So what we're seeing now is since my childhood, 30 years ago, we've seen a massive push to have more presence in the curriculum, to have folks have themselves represented. And so it's partly just about sort of seeing yourself, which can't be discounted, as Professor Crockett said, Dr. Crockett said, it's an important thing, but it's also about the quality of the education for everybody, right? Like, it does not benefit anybody to have this kind of information, this kind of history removed. This is not helping any students learn how to function in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. So I think the harms of Black and brown folks and marginalized folks and women, LGBTQ folks they're always gonna suffer the most. We're always gonna suffer the most. But I think by the same token, it's important both for messaging reasons, but also in reality that these books and these types of ideas and having a wide range of exposure is good for all children.
To your point, and bringing it back to sort of the reason for this entire movement, the CBAT movement, can you talk about how you envision or how you dream or how you think a center dedicated towards the eradication of racism and towards accountability and justice accountability on Princeton campus, how that could be beneficial, why that would be beneficial? I'm gonna open the floor to whoever is feeling inspired.
I mean, I'll jump in, Dr. Crockett, but you can feel free to cut me off. I mean, I think for me, the heart of what I do for work is around incubating good ideas and making them become a reality in the world. I mean, that's true for a lot of folks. But I think the reason that free speech is so important and the reason that we want to keep censors out of the way is because that's the way that we come up with new and better ideas about how we can live and work together, right? Like, it's how we get progress. It's how we get social justice. And I think an applied research center is sort of the epitome of that, right? Like a place that is singularly dedicated to putting forward ideas and solutions to society's problems, right? And being at a university allows you extra freedom to be a little bit off the wall sometimes too, right? Like, there are ways in which think tanks are funded and they have a particular mode and they sort of exist within the Beltway. But I think the marriage of the academic project, I mean, I teach and I litigate. I think that doing them both together is extremely powerful. And I think the idea of an applied research center is similar in that you're trying to sort of take these theoretical ideas, this scholarship, these new ideas, these folks who are pushing the boundaries of what we know and understand, and trying to translate that into the society that we want to see and want to live in. So I think more is better. And this is exactly the type of effort that we need now, but also always.
Mm-hmm.
For me is I think it could be beneficial so long as there is concerted effort to connect racism at Princeton or institutions similarly situated to Princeton with racism, in a particular, but not exclusively, anti-Blackness, more broadly speaking. And the reason I say that is because well, at this point, we have 3 generations of a Black bourgeois, and so Black folks have been at Princeton long enough for their parents to be legacy students at Princeton, and I think it can be a hard sell to convince whoever needs to be convinced that anti-Blackness at Princeton is similar to or as harmful as anti-Blackness, broadly speaking, because it's kind of like, oh, these are among the most privileged of Black folks. And so I think even I was part of Black Justice League during my time there. So I was at Princeton from the fall of 2013 until I graduated in 2017. And I think one thing that we didn't necessarily do the best job of was connecting anti-Blackness on campus and our demands for the institution, for the administration, to anti-Blackness more broadly speaking. And so specifically about how Black life could be improved on this small, relatively small suburban campus, but not about how it's connected to the communities from which we come. And so I think just that sort of class consciousness and recognition that like most Black people's lives and access to books and information is nothing like that of Black people at Princeton.
And for the audience, in a minute, we're going to open up the floor for any questions from you all. I have one more question for both Professor Sykes and Dr. Crockett, but please get your questions ready if you have any. We'll give you about 10 minutes. My final question for you both. What are some effective ways currently now, before we even have a center, what are some effective ways that we all can challenge book bans, censorship bills? Whether you're a parent, a student, or an educator, how can we advocate for intellectual freedoms? Professor Sykes, would you kick us off?
Sure. I mean, there are nowhere is immune. I'm here in Brooklyn. My kids just came home. They're downstairs. My wife is a teacher in middle school. We are in a very progressive, multi-ethnic neighborhood. We have a very progressive principal, and yet our school's DEI committee was invaded by folks who want to do away with the whole enterprise. So even in the bluest of blue, even in, brown Brooklyn, these voices who want to take these ideas out of schools exist. So I think one thing is to be vigilant and to start local. There's not a community in the country that hasn't been touched, even if we feel like we're a little bit insulated. So I encourage folks to act locally, because as we were talking about, some of these big pictures, some of these legal questions are tricky and the solutions are not obvious. But the most tangible thing we can do is make sure that those around us know what we value and what kinds of ideas we want to make sure are valuable in our schools and in our libraries. So I think, not everybody has the time. The good news is that a lot of like city council hearings and those kind of things are still available on Zoom. You can provide testimony in writing. You can, find your local alderman at the coffee shop and tell them that you care about these things. But I think, at the national level, of course, I would be remiss. My boss, who is also a Princeton alum, would want me to plug that you should join and support the ACLU. But there's so much you can do on the local level, I think, in our local communities, because that's really where the resistance has to be grounded.
Dr. Crockett?
I think while we are resisting the federal and like statewide book bans, remembering that we do still have the private, which, to your point, Professor Sykes, is harder to censor. And so by that I mean really, really local. So I live in Philadelphia. I like to joke, but it's true that in graduate school, I did not realize that while the University of Pennsylvania was warning its students against living past 34th, that like I would hear that, but I lived far past 34th because I lived in the neighborhood that looked most like the neighborhood from which I came in St. Louis. I've since moved, but I live in another Black neighborhood in which people have been there for generations. I've been really intentional about connecting myself to the Black folks in Philly. And when I say local, I mean the person who does my locks has both of the people who do my locks. One of them has like a 3-year-old, and the other person I've been with since her 8-year-old daughter was 3. And when I go get my hair done, I kid you not, I bring Black children's books in my book bag, and I have been doing that the entire time that I've lived in Philly. So I am the Black book lady. I'm trying to be the Black book lady in Philly. There's a different one, Black woman who does my eyebrows, who sometimes talks to me about our son. I have come to her with a list of Black YA children's books that, based off what she's told me about our child, it sounds like he might be interested in. I later on tonight, because I do this about 3 times a week, I'll be reading this with my nephew. This is our textbook that I've assigned the 2 of us for the next few weeks. That's the kind of thing I do in my family. And so while it would be a problem to rely too much on the private, again, because that is something that it could only suit the upper middle class and the wealthy, to remember what we still have in the private. Yeah.
And to that point, I implore us all to be the Black book lady or Black book man in our own communities. I love that. I love, love, love that. So I just encourage and just want to just sort of parlay that I hope we all just uplift other Black artists, writers, people of color to the younger generation, to let them know, as you had also said earlier, Professor Sykes, that we model what we value and what we fight for our younger generation. Before I hop on a soapbox, because y'all got me pumped up, I'd like to open the floor to anybody who has a question. Yes, Pancho Mulunjani. Pardon if I butchered your name.
Yeah, it's a Oshikwanyama name from the north of Namibia, so it's Mulongeni.
Mulongeni.
Yeah, southern Angola, northern Namibia. I think my question is, what do we do with all these fracture lines that I see as an outsider? Because there are a lot of people who are Black who don't like DEI because I'm not sure what reason, but they always love to show these videos on social media of this Black woman knows, and they use that as a excuse of why these critical race theory crusades, because it is like a crusade, should go on, because they put these images. And I think it's also similar with LGBT. We know that LGBT is still very divisive among Black communities. So how can we even deal with this when they all these fissure lines? That's all my question.
So I think 2 things. One is that historically, Black people who are a people have never all been on the same accord for anything. So like many of us who went to elementary school in the United States may have learned a little bit of civil rights history, but didn't learn really until college that not everybody wanted to march on Selma or thought that that was a good idea. Not everybody wanted to demand suffrage or thought that that was a good idea. Not every woman in the 19th century, not even every white woman in the 19th century thought it was a good idea for women to vote. And so I noticed that even from 2014 onward. So I'm from St. Louis, and my grandmother lives about 5 minutes away from the Ferguson Police Department. So, and I was home in St. Louis. I just gotten back like a few days before Mike Brown was killed. And even there, not all Black people agreed on everything. And I think that it's a function of anti-Blackness. I'm not saying like what you said in particular, but I think it's a function of anti-Blackness by the dominant majority, that we believe or have come to believe that every movement that we have requires us to all be in agreement when we are varied human beings who all think about things differently. And so we have to move anyway. and recognize the idea that using a few people or even many people who are like, no, I don't like DEI, or who are even like, well, I am pro-Trump, maybe I'm pro-book bans, maybe I'm anti-trans, that using those few people to justify harm, more broadly speaking, that is a tactic. We have to be able to see through the tactic. And then I think the last part of your question is recognizing that is a stereotype that Black people are particularly hostile to queer folks. Is I can understand why, because we are culturally unique. We have our own language for talking about things. We have our own understanding of gender, especially in the afterlife of slavery. How is Black womanhood queered in a way? How is Black masculinity and manhood queered in a way, since those gender identities are tied to property, to economics in the United States and in the West, broadly speaking. I think we have a unique relationship to queerness, but we are not uniquely homophobic. And so I think the answer to how do we understand concepts like Black homophobia is, I think really the question is, how do we understand or how do we mitigate the harms of homophobia, broadly speaking, which is inclusive of people who are homophobic and who happen to be Black.
That's phenomenal, Professor Crockett. The only thing I would add is that I think keep an eye on the coalitions. Like the only thing that is giving me, not the only thing, one of the things that's giving me a little bit of hope right now is that there is a very tenuously held together coalition that is backing a lot of these ideas. And the whatever 49.99 or 50.01% of folks who are broadly kind of what I would call on the other side from at least myself, I don't know who's on this call, but they don't necessarily back all of these things either, right? Like you're right, Black folks aren't a monolith, but neither is the opposition. And I think that we got to also be really, I mean, your question about can we count on our coalition within our ethnic group? Maybe, maybe not, but also we got to be creative about what other coalitions we can find, because I think that we have seen realignments and we are in the midst. I don't think we are done with the current realignment. And I think that we're going to see some more splintering of folks from various coalitions. So I think, you know, finding common cause with folks who care about free speech for other reasons is always something that we find extremely important, not just with this issue, but in lots of issue areas.
Ms. Belinda Redden, would you like to ask your question that you posed earlier in the chat? If not, I can go ahead and I'll go ahead and read it out loud. Would you mind clarifying what federal versus state and local authorities can do as it pertains to curriculum in K through 12 education?
It's a good question. I'll just say briefly that, I mean, there's levels of, I think of it as sort of levels of proximity, right? And levels of authority, right? So what's the appropriate level of authority for a principal to exert versus a superintendent is probably different. Like legally speaking, it's probably similar, but I think in practice, it's different. Similarly, like a local school board has a different set of authority. A state school board might have a different set of curricular authority, and depending on the school, curriculum might be created everywhere from the individual teacher all the way up to the State Department of Ed, and usually it's some mix of the two. So in terms of like who has a hand in crafting K-12 curriculum, it's on that spectrum, but the federal government provides significant funding, but really doesn't do a lot of curriculum setting. So that's why part of what we're looking at in these is like the substance of what's being banned. Part of it is how clear is it what actually is being banned, whether you agree with it or not. If it's unclear, it's vague, and it's its own constitutional problem. But we're also looking at who within the government is exercising this authority. I know I keep coming back to this, but it's a key question. And when it is the federal government, there's only so much they can do with regard to schools, which are basically run by the states, except for, like I said, the DOD schools. But even when the courts are generally pretty bad at this, right? When they see government official, it's capital G government, and that's the state acting. right? And they don't do a lot often of parsing through within academia too. There's these levels, as we talked about, deans and supervisors and, you know, vice, the provost and all those sorts of levels as well. So I think that it's all that is to say that there's lots of authority that's exercised over K-12 schools, but it's not unlimited, especially when it's when the changes to the curriculum are based on these partisan political issues and not any sort of real commitment to quality education.
Thank you, Professor Sykes. Any other questions from our audience while we have these really great thought thinkers with us today? Okay. Well, first and foremost, I want to say thank you so very much for your time, for your insight, for your energy. I think right now what is so necessary is that people maintain hope. And that's exactly a sensation that came out of this for me, is with all of the information that you imparted and sort of hearing what efforts that you are putting your work towards. Really appreciate your time, really appreciate your insights, really appreciate you sharing today. Could you all please join me, if you're on camera, just to give a little visual round of applause for Professor Sykes, Dr. Crockett. Really appreciate you all. And thank you all for coming to the CBAT panel discussion. I would like to also, before you guys leave though, I would like to please pass the baton over to one of our CBEP Board of Director members, Mr. Robert Cushney, who has a few words to say before we let you guys go for the rest
Props
of
to the moderator. Props to the moderator.
Oh, thank you. It was fun. This was fun for me. Like I said, you got me pumped up. I'm going to the aldermen. I'm looking at the school I work at and saying, well, they're pretty good at it, but I'm about to take some of the things that you guys said and absolutely put them into action. So thank you, truly.
Unmute, Kush.
There we go. Thank you, Ariel. I think you've got this panel, including you, Ariel, have gotten a lot of folks here pumped up. And so I can't thank you enough, our esteemed panelists, Professor Sykes and Dr. Crockett, our moderator, of course, again, Edgar, who kicked us off, and the entire events committee, enough for leading us through such an informative and insightful discussion of such a critical and timely subject. I'd also like to thank all of those who raised questions or made comments to expand the discussion here today. Actually, I wrote down, and we could not, of course, incorporate all your questions, but I guess we did incorporate all the questions. And so it's my turn. Please be sure to keep up with CBAP by visiting CBAP info, one word, .com, where we have a calendar posted with all of our meetings in which we encourage you to join and participate. Meetings are as short sometimes as a half an hour if you join us on Mondays for events programming, where we plan panels like the one you've seen today. And you can also find us on YouTube, where we post panels, and write to us at CBAP at cbapinfo.com. That's CBAP at cbapinfo.com. It's probably clear to all that on the call today that the mission of the center is to combat and eradicate racism. The big picture plan is that a center will support cutting-edge applied research that identifies solutions with the goal of disseminating findings to use for the elimination of racism and remediation of its adverse effects. CBAP's mission envisions discussions and work that reach far beyond what has been shared and discussed this afternoon. And as we move into the future, we want to, and in fact, we must continue to maintain momentum and broaden our reach and impact by encouraging you, those of you who recognize opportunities, to work with us and to actually join us. You can begin in that participation today by joining our meeting after the meeting, or our MAM, hosted by Fred Dashell, class of 76. And you can do that just by remaining on this Zoom call. Our next event will be a reunions panel. So we hope to see you in person on campus or again virtually, because it will be a hybrid event. This is our 5th year. I believe this is our fourth reunion panel. And we're very proud of the work we've done so far. We invite as many as you as possible to join the various committees we have. They include a fundraising committee. They include a committee where we do marketing, and several others that you can find at cbap.com. All right, I guess that's, I'll turn things over to Fred. Again, thanks to our illustrious panel and our fabulous moderator. I don't get pumped up a lot. I want some Stevie Wonder front row tickets, and the radio station told me I needed to practice sounding excited on the radio. So I don't get pumped up very easily, and that's a true story. And I've gotten really pumped up with this. In any case, Fred Dashell will take over, I believe, from here, unless I missed something. And
yes, thank you so much, Mr. Cushney. Appreciate that. And to his point, if you are interested in joining CBAP or donating, the information is in the chat. Very quickly, I'd like to turn it over to our ABPA's president, Michael Gunter.
Am I off mute? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of ABPA, who was a co-sponsor of this event, thank you for attending. In times such as these, I understand more than ever that our presence is powerful and our presence is sometimes intimidating, and that gathering together with one another to impart our expertise, our experiences, our hopes, our dreams, our failures, our successes represents a small show of resistance to forces that would rather we be scattered or not present at all. So I'm glad we're seizing this chance to gather, because however small it is, our circle of control exists. And understanding that is a basic building block of action. We control how we spent this hour together, where we direct our energy, and we control what we build here together today, and how we act upon what we learn. Again, thank you, Professor Sykes. Thank you, Dr. Crockett, for being here, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. If you would like to stay, please just stay on the call, but otherwise, have a great rest of your Sunday.
So, good evening, folks. This is Fred Dashell, class of 76. And the format of what we call the meeting after the meeting is